The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education, connect to a world of learning.
"21st century China is modernizing at breakneck speed. For the last century or so, it seemed that China was merely trying to catch up with standards of science and technology set by the West.
But if you take the longer view, if your perspective is not a few hundred years, but a few thousand years, by any measure it was China that was at the vanguard of science and technology. In fact, it turns out that many Western inventions were not inventions at all, but borrowings from China. If we want to explain the blossoming of knowledge in the West, it pays to look east, to what the Chinese knew.
Modern China's distinctive identity has evolved over thousands of years. It is one of the oldest and most successful civilizations, a society whose strength depended on science and technology. In fact, from 600 to 1500 AD, China was the most technologically advanced society on Earth. Like all budding cultures, the Chinese gathered knowledge through careful observation and experimentation. They watched the endless cycles of the sun, moon and stars, and marveled at the force of nature. Over millennia, their understanding of the elements grew, and the Chinese found ways to harness the powers of earth, metal, wood, water and fire.
Normally we think of fire as a destructive element, but it can also be a force for creation.
Early Chinese alchemists believed the secret to eternal life and powerful medicines lay in combining just the right ingredients over a fire. Some recipes even called for heating concoctions up to a year. Around 300 AD, the alchemists began to create elixirs of sulfur, saltpeter, and various plants. It took another 700 years of singed beards and charred houses before researchers learned to add pure charcoal to sulfur and saltpeter. Blending the three made what they called huo yao, the fire drug. By sheer coincidence, they discovered gunpowder. The new invention created bright sparks, and so the Chinese used it for celebration. They invented the world's first fireworks. After fireworks, it didn't take long for gunpowder to find its new destiny: war. For thousands of years, arrows were the primary weapon in Chinese warfare. But around 1150 AD, during the Song dynasty, someone came up with the idea to tie a bamboo tube packed with gunpowder to the arrow and add a fuse. Next, they attached a tiny iron weight near the feathers to tilt the arrowhead up for a longer flight. It was the world's first rocket. But the idea was in its infancy. Over the next 2 centuries, weapons designers found ways to maximize the rocket's potential. To make it more powerful, they drilled holes straight through the center of the gunpowder so that the powder burnt evenly and shot the gas backward, causing the arrow to streak directly forward. Then they constricted the opening at the back, raising the pressure inside the tube to create even more thrust. This type of rocket had a range of up to 10 football fields. But firing one rocket at a time is not very effective. So they developed a multiple rocket launcher. These rockets used a non-explosive gunpowder which simply propelled the arrows forward. Although they didn't explode, they did enough to stun and amaze the emperor's enemies. So you can thank the Chinese for your 4th of July light show. The Chinese also found inspiration in another basic element: water. The early Chinese reaped the benefits of water by rerouting rivers and creating vast systems of canals. Water was not only used for practical purposes, it also reflected the way the Chinese viewed the earth. They even saw water when they looked to the heavens above. For thousands of years, Chinese astronomers studied the stars and planets flowing in their endless course across the sky, like the path of some unfathomable river. They seem to run their course around one star, the North Star. Because the North Star's position remained constant, the Chinese used it to map the location of every other star in the sky. This method of positioning stars is called the equatorial system, and the Chinese have been using it for about 2,000 years, nearly 2 millennia before the West. This is an equatorially mounted instrument called an armillary sphere, used to measure positions of the Moon and planets. It is housed at the National Astronomical Instrument Museum in Beijing.
This is where modern astronomy begins. For the system used here, of the equatorial armillary, is the same system adopted by Western astronomers and which is still used today in modern observatories. The difference being, of course, is that we have a great big whacking telescope with which to see the stars. But in its day, this was state-of-the-art.
The armillary is lined up with the North Star. Chinese astronomers pinpointed stars with the sighting tube and then catalogued their location by counting the markings on the rotating rings. The first equatorial armillaries were built around the 1st century AD, but 1,200 years later, Chinese astronomers were using it to predict the positions of the heavenly bodies to within a 20th of a degree. Not bad for the naked eye. The ancient Chinese believed the stars held the secrets to their destinies. The positions of the heavenly bodies foretold auspicious times for imperial marriages, births, and wars. The imperial stargazers carefully studied the sky for signs and along the way made many astronomical discoveries. Like this supernova that formed the Crab Nebula in 1054 AD. In fact, the Chinese were the very first people in history to recognize and record supernovae. They called them guest stars because they shone brightly for a few weeks and disappeared. Modern astronomers learned from these supernova records about the births of certain nebulae. But for the Chinese, events like supernovae, eclipses and famines were sent as warnings from heaven that the imperial family was not ruling well. Emperors sought to connect events on Earth with those in the heavens. Failed crops or famine could mean the end of a dynasty, but so could unpredicted eclipses. The emperor relied on his astronomers and astrologers to predict heavenly events to help him avoid earthly disasters. The imperial court became fertile breeding ground for new ideas and technology. This is Kaifeng City, 400 miles south of Beijing. Around 960 AD, one of China's golden ages blossomed here into the Song dynasty, a 300-year period ripe with innovation. Kaifeng was the dynasty's first capital. This city of nearly 4.5 million people has been an important centre of Chinese civilization for about 3,000 years. But even today, the city retains many features specific to the Song dynasty's culture. At 7 o'clock each night, the city's food market sets up in a mad rush, each vendor hoping to be the first to dish up his wares. This tradition of eating out began during the Song dynasty, when expanding commerce brought money and people to the capital. The world's first restaurants sprung up, and food like dumplings and noodles became widely available to the masses for a small price. The architecture in Kaifeng's new historic district is based on the style of the Song capital. This temple lies at the northern end of the city's historic district. It was built in honour of emperors who ruled Kaifeng during its imperial days. The location was chosen because buried far below this building are the ruins of the Song Imperial Palace. This is a model of the ancient palace grounds. Hidden among the impressive walls and buildings is one of mankind's greatest inventions, a 30-foot tower the inventor called a cosmic engine, the world's first mechanical clock.
This scene is a monument to one of the greatest breakthroughs of intellectual history. The fellow on my left here, Su Song, was a mathematician, astronomer, and all-round genius who's explaining his invention, a mechanical water clock, to the Emperor Zhao Xu in the year 1092.
Early Chinese astronomers often equated the heavens with water, since stars seemed to drift across the night sky like a giant flowing river. They frequently used water to drive simple machines, which mimicked the motion of the stars. The problem they faced was keeping the mechanism operating at a precise rate. Su Sung solved that problem with a mechanism which today is known as a mechanical escapement. Inside Su Sung's armillary clock, a stream of water turned a large wheel equipped with cups. As the measured weight of water forced one cup down, the wheel moved forward one cog. A series of weights and locks kept it from recoiling or from moving forward too quickly. This mechanical escapement captured time in precise increments. A chain drive, another Chinese invention, rotated the armillary at the top. One complete rotation for each day, replicating the movement of the stars. Although this machine was primarily used as an astronomical showpiece, its mechanical escapement was the foundation of modern mechanical clocks. In a few hundred years, China would drop this technology while the West, much later, went on to create clocks using weights and springs instead of water to drive the escapement. For nearly 35 centuries, the Chinese have kept carefully dated, detailed, and reliable records. This is Jinhua village in central China. It is in this bucolic atmosphere that I find remnants of another ancient Chinese technology that dates from the 2nd century BC. Paper. Villagers here in Jinhua earn their living by making paper the traditional way, sheet by sheet. Gathering the material they use to make paper is as simple as going into the backyard. The villagers use bamboo, which grows in abundance on these mountainsides. Workers cut the bamboo down, dry it, and chop it into chips. Then they steam the chips until they're crumbly and moist. Next, the bamboo is soaked in bleach and ground into a thick mush. Once the mush is white, they grind it again into liquid pulp, perfect for paper. 3 centuries ago, the process took 100 days. Now, it takes a week. Once they've suspended the pulp in a vat of water, they use screens to gather a thin layer and then lay the new paper out to drain with one sweeping, elegant motion. This family has been making paper here for 14 generations, nearly 300 years. In the beginning, paper wasn't anywhere near as thin as these sheets drying on the wall. In fact, people used the earliest paper to make blankets and clothing accessories. Eventually, the Chinese refined the process and created a smooth, thin material, ideal for writing. 1,000 years later, long before the West had even started making paper, the Chinese were already working on a new idea, the printed word. Printing was an idea that flourished around 1000 AD, once again during the Song dynasty. From then on, information could be easily duplicated and distributed.
This is Qingming Riverside Park in Kaifeng. If you can look beyond the tourists with their video cameras and their cell phones, every detail in this park, the architecture and the costumes, is an exact replica of what life was like here in the 11th century.
I'm here because scattered throughout this park are hints of China's technological past, at a time when Kaifeng was a lively centre of trade and commerce. And the reason why this park is so authentic is because it was modelled after a 16-foot-long scroll by artist Zhang Zeduan. He captured a snapshot of ancient Kaifeng during his lifetime, detailing Song lifestyle, costume and architecture. Today the park is one of the few places where ancient tools and techniques are still alive, including the first methods of print, a simple process which revolutionized the intellectual world.
What we're seeing here is the process of printing from a woodcut. Now, all a woodcut is a piece of wood with the image you want carved in reverse. You take ink, apply it to the wood, put on your piece of paper, apply pressure, and you have a printed image.
Having come up with the woodcut, the Chinese then ran with the idea. They made small woodcuts with individual characters inscribed on the back. They had invented, in other words, movable type. It was another critical invention that arose during the Song dynasty. But the reason movable type didn't take off in China was that instead of using a few dozen letters, they used thousands of characters, each one representing a different word. This obstacle limited the use of movable type, but printing continued. It was in China that the information age truly began.
By 812 AD, the Chinese had combined two of their greatest innovations, paper and printing, to produce a third. It comes in all shapes and sizes, makes the world go round, and it is, of course, paper money. Now, the Chinese called it flying money because it flew out of their pockets, which is a problem I still have. However, it was destined for a very long career. Western Europe got its first printed money in Sweden in 1661. But the US wouldn't see printed money until 1690.
At the same time the Chinese were inventing paper, they were also developing a new technology that would reshape the world. Artisans in China have been throwing pottery for thousands of years. But by the 1st century AD, they had created something completely new, called porcelain. To make it, Chinese potters mixed pure kaolin clay with porcelain stone. But the crucial ingredient was heat. It takes temperatures of about 2400 degrees Fahrenheit to fuse clay into these delicate, glass-like pieces born of earth, water and fire. The West wouldn't create porcelain for another 1700 years.
One of the reasons why the rest of the world had to come here to get its porcelain was that nowhere else did they have a furnace capable of generating the high temperatures you need to make true porcelain.
The Chinese mastered intense heat when they learned how to turn common iron ore into cast iron and, ultimately, into steel. The secret to achieving extreme temperatures for their famous porcelain was known to the Chinese for centuries. They created furnaces using refractory or heat-resistant clay tiles, which could withstand enough heat to transform iron ore. Able to pour this molten iron into moulds, the ancient Chinese discovered the world's first cast iron and quickly put it to work in their fields. With wrought iron, you have to hammer out each item, one at a time. But with cast iron, you can easily replicate products like this plough from a mould, again and again.
This design represented a huge increase in efficiency on anything that had gone before. For one, it could be produced relatively quickly and economically. But the real advantage was here, in the field. With a plough like this, he could pull the plough along with a fraction of the effort needed to pull a conventional plough. The part of the plough that does the work is known as the share, the point here. And with a plough such as this, you drastically reduce the effort you need to cut the soil. At the same time as the ploughshare cuts the earth, the mould board turns the soil in the air. Now, if that seems obvious, that's because every great idea seems obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't obvious to anyone outside China.
Cast iron allowed the Chinese to mass-produce farm equipment like this, quickly and easily, but it was far from perfect. The high content of carbon in cast iron makes the metal fairly brittle, so the ancient Chinese created a metal with more resilience: steel.
This is a 21st century blast furnace. It's called a blast furnace because there's a machine, like a giant hot air dryer, that blows air in from the top. The more oxygen in the furnace, the higher the temperature, the less carbon in the mix, the different properties of steel at the end. The basic principles, this wonderful alchemy of carbon, iron and oxygen, were known to the Chinese over 2,000 years ago.
Around the 2nd century BC, the Chinese realized you could produce steel cheaply by blowing air into molten cast iron. To generate a regulated and constant stream of air, they invented the double-action piston bellows. Here's how it worked. It's equipped with dual intake valves. As you push a piston in, Compressed air on one side of the bellows closes the chamber's valve and forces the air out through the bottom. Meanwhile, the other valve opens as pulling sucks air into its chamber. Pushing and pulling creates a continuous flow of air, the genesis of the blast furnace. Eventually, it was this technique that made it possible to mass-produce inexpensive steel.
Steel is the backbone of modernity. Without steel, there's no airplanes, no automobiles, no railroads. The invention, the discovery of mass-produced steel was nothing less than a revolution.
Industry was one reason the imperial city of Kaifeng flourished. People flocked here in search of work. But as the Song Empire grew, so did the need to protect its borders. In Qingming Park, tourists can experience their history during that period. It is here at the firing range that I find simplified replicas of the deadly weaponry used to defend the thriving Song Empire.
For over 2,000 years, this was a standard issue weapon in the Chinese arsenal. It is, of course, a crossbow, and it is yet another Chinese invention. A standard bow is ultimately limited by the strength in the archer's arm. But with this, you can store the tension in this bow and release it when you please with a trigger. This is a very crude mechanism of a crossbow, but we know that by the 3rd century BC, the Chinese were making these to a quite extraordinary degree of precision, with bronze trigger mechanisms with 3 moving parts.
The trigger worked like this. A warrior could pull back the bowstring using the weight of his body and store all that tension by sliding the string behind 2 hooks. Pulling the trigger released the hooks and sent the bolt flying. It was crucial that the bronze trigger was precise. They said that if the trigger was off by the width of a grain of rice, it wouldn't work. This lethal Chinese invention would not be surpassed until the age of the firearm. China's technological innovations remained hidden from the world for centuries, concealed by linguistic and geographic barriers. The power of wind has made its mark on Earth since the beginning of time, turning rock into sand, churning oceans, and repainting the landscape of the sky. The ancient Chinese carefully observed that power, and 2,300 years ago, they invented a way to harness it. Early kites were shaped like birds, but today their designs are limited only by the imagination. The first kites were used by the military to intimidate their enemies and drop messages of propaganda behind enemy walls. There were even stories of kites powerful enough to lift human beings. I went to Weifang, a city in northeast China, in search of traditional handmade kites. The artists make kites in the traditional way. They heat slices of bamboo and shape them into the skeletons of flight. The exotic frames are glued together and covered with a thin layer of silk, which becomes the skin of the kite. But it's the bright acrylic paint that brings the silk dragon heads to life. This kite is more than 100 feet long, with approximately 1 disc per foot.
Very, very strong.
Segmented kites like this generate more lift because each segment adds wind resistance, so that even a mild gust can easily lift this monstrous dragon. But the most important lesson the ancient Chinese learned from kite technology was how to ride the wind.
For the greater part of the history of sailing, the technology of Chinese sailboats has been drastically superior to anything that any Westerner had. Much of that superiority lay in the sails. This is called a batten sail. The battens are the strips of bamboo, and the advantage of them is that they give mariners great flexibility. If the wind is strong, they can only raise 1 or 2 battens. If the wind is weak, they can raise them all.
The parallel battens keep the sail from billowing out too far and losing thrust. Another revolutionary innovation was aligning pivoting sails along the axis of the boat, so they could catch the wind from different directions.
In the West, sails tended to be at right angles with the boat, and that meant they could only sail properly when the wind was behind them. But with this, you could sail with the wind in 3/4. If it looks familiar, that's because every modern Western yacht you've seen has copied this design.
The West borrowed other Chinese maritime innovations: rudders to steer ships, leeboards to reduce downwind drift, and watertight compartments to keep boats afloat, even if the hull was breached. Chinese officials in court rituals faced the emperor just as the other stars faced the North Star, so they built their imperial palaces with the throne room facing south. From the palace to the sprawling empire at its feet, imperial cities like Kaifeng were built on a precise north-south axis. The ancient Chinese invented something to guide them in finding north-south lines: the magnetic compass.
Originally, compasses pointed not north, but south, and the original compasses looked like this. By the 4th century BC, Chinese alchemists had discovered the properties of lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic material which, if left free to spin, would align itself with the Earth's magnetic field.
These early compasses were called south pointers because the spoon-shaped lodestone always pointed south. Chinese sailors found the compass indispensable on water. By the 12th century, large fleets of Chinese junks were roaming the Earth, sailing as far as Africa.
Before it could be used on a ship, the south pointer needed a little finessing. It'll work fine on a perfectly calm day, but with a little wind or a little bucking of the deck, it'll swing around wildly and it's next to useless. Now at some point, someone figured out that you can use a lodestone to magnetize a plain, ordinary piece of iron. If you take an iron needle, rub it with a magnet, it will behave exactly as a lodestone would. If you then stick that needle through a piece of bamboo, float it in a bowl of water, you have, in effect, a modern compass. It will align itself north to south. Now, it might not look like much, but with this, you don't need the sun and the stars. No matter how dark and stormy the night, no matter how bad the weather, you can always find your way home.
The Chinese believed a life force called qi flowed through everything. When qi was in balance, it brought health and peace. By the 1st century BC, Chinese doctors had worked out a theory to describe the path the qi takes around the body. They believed it circulated through a network similar to our blood vessels, but invisible. The Chinese believed the healthy flow of qi through the body also depends on blood. The ancient Greeks understood veins and arteries contained blood, but the Chinese realized it circulated. By studying cadavers, they also discovered blood vessels are connected to internal organs.
Chinese doctors used bellows and bamboo tubes to demonstrate how the heart pumped blood around the body. Now, their theories weren't exactly correct. They believed it took the blood 29 minutes to move around the body, where in fact it's closer to 1. But the important point is this. Hundreds of years before a European doctor caught on to the idea, the Chinese had got it. Circulation.
China has suffered 3 of the 4 deadliest earthquakes in recorded history. In 3,000 years, they recorded more than 2,000 quakes. These are the oldest seismological records on Earth.
To the Chinese, an earthquake was not just a natural disaster. It was, in a sense, a deeply unnatural occurrence, a sign that something was profoundly wrong with the cosmos. The emperor was not ruling as he should.
So for the emperor, it was very important to know when and where an earthquake had struck. In the 2nd century AD, a new invention provided him that crucial information. It was a 6-foot-wide bronze seismoscope, an ingenious device invented by mathematician and astronomer Cheng Hung. There were 8 dragons, 1 for each principal point on a compass. Each dragon held a bronze ball in its mouth. When the Earth shook, the dragon facing the direction of the quake dropped its ball into the mouth of the toad below, alerting the palace. No one is sure how the interior of the seismoscope worked, but most experts believe an inverted pendulum at the heart of the mechanism controlled the dragon's jaws. The vibration swung the pendulum in the direction of the quake, which then triggered the dragon's mouth to open and drop the ball.
Earthquake prediction remains a very inexact science, but if we ever get it right, we may have the Chinese, yet again, to thank.
The ancient Chinese believed that qi animated everything in nature, including human beings. They continued studying the qualities of the Earth's materials and elements. Their discoveries inspired them to keep innovating and made China a pioneer of science and technology. Today in China, that trend continues.
One of the greatest puzzles in world history is that it was not China, but the West, the divided, warring West, that went on to explore, colonize, and dominate the globe. China turned in on itself, forgetting the brilliant centuries of innovation in science and technology that had gone before. Trade and commerce passed into Western hands. The exchange of ideas became one way. When Jesuit missionaries showed the Emperor of China a mechanical clock, he was astonished, being unawares that it was not the Europeans, but the Chinese who had invented the clock in the first place. Only in recent decades have the Chinese rediscovered their creative energies, and the results, as are plain to see, have been spectacular.